Hey, and welcome to Geopolitics 411. Super excited, of course, as always. And today we're looking at the story of Zimbabwe, and this is necessitated by the president, of course. The president, that is Emmerson Mnangagwa, is probably facing pressure to resign. But will he resign? Well, only time will tell. So there's an internal split in the ruling party, of which is, of course, the president leads, called ZANU-PF party. And this is driving fears of a possible coup attempt against Mnangagwa, who, by chance of being maybe an African or maybe learned the best from his predecessor, wants to stay in power beyond 2028, despite a constitutional bar that gives him a service of 2 terms. So President Emmerson is facing what some experts are calling the biggest threat to his rule yet, as succession battle erupts ahead of the general elections that are scheduled in 2028. The president and some supporters who, of course, belong to ZANU-PF have been trying to push for extension of his rule towards 2030, and they've been singing that this agenda must go on. However, due to this 2030 agenda that they are calling, this has led to protests in the country within and also from members of his party. So the protesters are calling for the president to step down or be forced to do so. And I'm sure, I mean, he's going through what he probably put his predecessor through, because the former president also went through that. And when Mnangagwa came in, he promised to uphold the constitution, change Zimbabwe to a better country, and all the good things that they promise. You know, African leaders are very good at talking and promising heaven on earth and delivering nothing. So that is what Mnangagwa is facing in Zimbabwe. So can he survive beyond 2028? Well, the constitution has a 2-term limit for president, and Mnangagwa is actually serving his 2nd term. So with a 2nd elected term, it means it ends in 2028, and that is when elections are due. So constitutionally, he's supposed to finish in 2028. But of course, having Zimbabwe having experienced dictatorship of the former president, maybe Mnangagwa feels it's another chance for him. And you know, ZANU-PF members who are part of the systems in the prior government, maybe they feel it's something they experience and they want to relive. However, some members of the ZANU-PF have been chanting that 2030 agenda since actually 2024, which is last year, saying that the president should stay in power for a 3rd term to continue his reforms, which of course violates the constitution. So during a conference in December last year, the ZANU-PF party officially adopted a motion to extend Mnangagwa's rule till 2030. Imagine a whole party that declares itself as democratic coming up with a system where they feel that they should extend the service of the president. So during that conference, the agreement that they came up with, the motion that they adopted, is subject to approval of the Senate. Of course, they haven't done that because they need a national referendum. But the motion is what has prompted a lot of the nationwide debate and controversy, which has led to protests. So the protests that have been happening as a result of that motion, and there has been dismissal after the protests happened. We have seen dismissal of top security officials, a move that, of course, experts say Mnangagwa is taking to avoid being overthrown in a coup, because, you know, Africa has experienced coups across, especially West Africa region. And so Mnangagwa is probably afraid that if the top leadership of the security forces stay in place, then these guys are probably going to stage a coup against him. And since he doesn't want to go through that, of course, he decided, you know what? Get these guys out of their positions of power and dismiss them. And so he did that. So earlier in the week, actually, even last week, demonstrators took to the streets in protests that were called by a top ZANU-PF member. So you can see that the split in the party is actually major. If already a member of the ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party, is already calling for protests, and the citizens are showing up. So you may ask, what's the problem within or with ZANU-PF? So there's an internal split within that party, and this party is actually the party that has held into power since Zimbabwe's independence in 1980. I mean, that's one of the oldest parties. That's 40 plus years. So this is what is actually driving the current crisis. And I feel like a lot of young people are nowadays coming up and saying, we need to do away with the old, what used to be called previously institutional memory, which was observed as a way of, transitioning and people learning how to govern and such and such. But then the citizens are feeling this idea of having the old still in place is what is stagnating nations. So maybe Zimbabwe, this is one of the things they are trying to get out. So we have two main factions at loggerheads in this party. One is the one supporting a prolonged term for the 82-year-old Mnangagwa. And by the way, African leaders, at 82, why do you still want to extend to be a president at 82? Like, sit down, do business, watch your grandchildren, write biographies, be an eminent person who can help the continent grow. But no, you still want to fight in power. Seriously, like African leaders, what is your problem? It's about time you sit and think about it. We have a whole generation behind you. Those are generations that you still want to rule. Are you okay? Anyway, that is the story of Mnangagwa at 82. He still wants another chance. And the other faction is supporting the ascendancy of Constantino Chiwenga, who is his 68-year-old vice president. This to me, it makes sense. At 68, if he's a vice president, I believe he could probably, I don't know in terms of leadership, he is the best. But if we are to use age as a judgment, I think a 68-year-old person has more sense and mental capability to lead a country. And so as a fellow African who supports the best for African, I feel Mnangagwa should just go home after 2028. I mean, you're 80, you're a grandfather, go do grandfather things. Grandfathers are not supposed to be leading nations, in my opinion. So Mnangagwa came to power in 2017 amid promises of democratic and economic reforms. Again, very beautiful. Every African leader promises that, but most of them deliver the opposite. So critics, however, say that corruption has remained high, the opposition has been targeted, and the economy has continued to slide. This sounds like a very familiar script for people across East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, maybe. These are things that all the leaders we have in place are actually facing and the citizens are complaining against. So it seems like Africa is just one big village facing almost the same problems. So Zimbabwe has for decades been marred by political crises that have led to economic stagnation, a dearth of jobs, general government dysfunction, hyperinflation, of course, due to sanctions that were issued, especially in the past decades. And this has pushed the economy to its knees. And so the citizens had a lot of hopes in their new president in 2017. However, the results are different. So the first lady, who's by the name Auxilia Mnangagwa, who's of course the wife to Mnangagwa, alongside her husband and several other government officials, were actually sanctioned by the United States in March 2024 for alleged involvement in illicit diamond and gold networks. So this is something that has been going on even with the previous regime. They went through the same. In 2023, an Al Jazeera investigation revealed that Zimbabwe officials were using smuggling gangs to sell the country's gold to soften the impact of sanctions. So you see, the previous regime of Robert Mugabe faced sanctions for similar issues of export and issues of diamond selling to the wrong people and all that. Again, this guy comes in, promises heaven to the citizens, but takes the country through the same. However, this time it was them who were sanctioned, not the country. So you see, the whole of this idea, having someone who's sanctioned leading your country, of course, causes trouble in how a nation is run. And that's why I think the citizens are feeling it's time we bring this to an end. So why is the current crisis evoking memories of Robert Mugabe's ouster? You remember, he did not go home because he was ousted. So to many, the current crisis is a reminiscent of the fall of Robert Mugabe. This guy had held on to power for 37 years before being deposed in a coup in 2017. So you see, Mnangagwa is afraid of the same experience that he went, he came into power through a coup. Now he's afraid of the same, but the kind of treatment he's giving the citizens, I mean, it's only the citizens who will decide the way forward. Either they wait for 2028 and send him home, or with the protests going on, we can only sit and watch. So Mugabe was forced out at the age of 93. Can you believe at 93 someone was still holding on to, like at 93 you can't even walk, you can't even think straight, but you still want to lead a nation. Mnangagwa is 82. I think he learned from the best that he thinks at 82 he can continue ruling a country. I mean, I think African leaders, it's time you wake up and think, and by the time you're hitting 75 and plus, move and change your ways. So he led the country's fight for independence. This is Mugabe, and however his subsequent rule was characterized by the repression of opposition members, which is ongoing even at the moment, election rigging, corruption, and economic stagnation. And they refused to give up the presidency for decades. So maybe the current guy thinks he could do the same, but no. So Mnangagwa was a long-time ally of Mugabe, and he served as a defense minister, and then vice president in the final years of Mugabe's rule. And of course, he had close ties to the military. So a lot of the people in the military who organized for the coup were, of course, through him because he had ties with that. So that's why he's making a lot of top security changes and dismissal, because he knows everyone, and I believe he knows people who can initiate a coup. Hence why he's like, you must go. However, the two men fell out. Now, Mugabe and Mnangagwa fell out over who would succeed Mugabe. And Mnangagwa was backed by the army. On one hand, Mugabe wanted to hand over power to his wife, Grace Mugabe. Africa again, we must wake up. What makes you think as a man, because your wife has been your wife, that you can now govern a country? Or you can just hand over power to them. Anyway, kudos to the people of Zimbabwe who said no. I mean, at least they got someone else in power, although the person seems to be disappointing them. At least they've experienced someone different in power, and so that is a push for democracy, essentially. Mnangagwa is unlikely to be successful in prolonging his rule because of a citizen that is, one, fed up with political machinations, and because of the deep internal splits in ZANU-PF. And I believe the idea of people experiencing a new government has opened their minds to better or a different experience. So yeah, that's what is happening in Zimbabwe, and we are watching and waiting to see if President Mnangagwa will survive, or he will actually take the pressure and resign, or he will wait for 2028 and allow someone else to step in as president and push Zimbabwe to a better nation. Yeah, so we're watching that. If you're in Zimbabwe, actually, you can share with us in the comment section what the country feels so far, you know, as a citizen, what you feel about it. And if you're African, just tell us the lessons you're taking from this country and what you feel should be next for Africa generally, and in terms of the leadership we have. Thank you for watching Geopolitics 411. See you on the next episode.